Welcome to Data Skeptic Consensus. This is the 14th installment in our series about how multi-agent systems achieve collective decision-making. And as I'm sitting down here in the studio to record this episode, we in the United States just elected our 46th president. I didn't win, which is fine. It's not something I was expecting. If you wrote me in, thank you. That's great, but it's also a little creepy. I am what you call an irrelevant alternative, or at least that's what Kenneth Arrow might have referred to me as in his 1950 paper, A Difficulty in the Concept of Social Welfare. You may have heard of these ideas under a more canonical name, which is Arrow's Impossibility Theorem. It's an often quoted and rarely explained result that has quite a bit of nuance, so I thought I'd do an episode all about that. So what is Arrow's Impossibility Theorem? It's an observation about voting systems, specifically rank choice voting systems. It's a counterintuitive observation. If you're thinking something along the lines of Epicurus' trilemma or the Gödel incompleteness theorem, you're in the right neighborhood. Maybe more accessibly, you've heard this phrase. A lot of project-based professionals, like graphic designers, will say the project can be fast, it can be cheap, or it can be done very well. You get to pick 2 out of 3. Also reminds me a bit of the famous CAP theorem of distributed computing. But Arrow's theorem is actually very different from that one. It's a little bit closer to Alan Turing's famous halting problem. So Turing found an interesting impossibility result in fundamental computer science that we call the halting problem, because essentially it tells us that there's no universal way to look at a computer program and decide if it will halt, meaning stop, meaning finish and end, if it'll halt on all inputs. If you've never heard of that, you might be a little skeptical of it. And rightly so if you're a programmer or someone who's benefited from one of these advanced code analysis options that are out now. There are many compilers and IDEs and CI/CD services and all types of great stuff that will detect things like infinite loops and dead code and stuff like that. So if some feature of your compiler or runtime or whatever can detect infinite loops, how can we reconcile that with the halting problem? How can both of these things be true? Well, read the fine print on that fancy software. For sure, it can detect some infinite loops. So can I. So can you. If that software is very clever and well written, it might even be able to detect lots and lots of infinite loops. But it can't detect all of them. Although here's an interesting, audacious claim. Maybe somebody could develop software that would detect all the infinite loops a sane computer programmer might ever think to write. If so, that would automate a lot of QA testing. But when we talk about the set of all possible algorithms, the halting problem, which we won't cover today, says it's not possible to detect all of those. We can't be sure any computer is ever going to stop doing what it's doing, even if the code seems to suggest that it should. In almost all cases, at least one, we don't know. Back to Arrow's Impossibility Theorem, we find a similar idea. Let's define voting in a very broad sense. Voting, specifically the voting mechanism, how we go from all of the votes to some decision. Well, that's a function. It maps from a vector of all the votes to that decision, binary or otherwise. And that is a lot of possible functions to consider. Thankfully, we can ignore the vast majority of the systems that are out there for simple things. Like what about the voting system that says the third vote turned in decides the election? Let's just take that off the table right away. So if we're looking for the best possible voting system, maybe we can whittle it down in some way and figure out, is there an ideal voting system to use? Well, the way we whittle it down from all possible voting systems to the one we're going to choose, Arrow's Impossibility Theorem uses a number of seemingly reasonable criteria. Let's put a pin in what those criteria are for the moment. I'll come back to them and walk you through them. But let's talk about the structure of the theorem. It says that there is absolutely no voting system out there which can satisfy all of these criteria. So as I start going over the criteria, remember, if you like them all, and I expect you will, they're pretty reasonable criteria, they cannot all hold. So first criteria, independence of irrelevant alternatives. Earlier I declared myself an irrelevant alternative, even if I had announced formally announced my candidacy for President of the United States 2020, that fact should not have impacted your preferences of Biden over Trump or Trump over Biden. In other words, literally no one would say, I was planning to vote for Biden, but now that this Kyle guy is on the ticket, I'm going to go for Trump. This is different from third-party candidates like Ross Perot or Ralph Nader or whoever. People might love an outsider candidate, but there should be a sort of transitivity here. You wouldn't flip-flop preferences over A and B in the presence of C. Now, one quick aside here, because there was an argument somebody gave me as I was running this past a few people. What about Andrew Yang? This guy shows up on the scene and starts talking about universal basic income. For many people, this was their introduction to that topic. And regardless of how many minds he influenced in one direction or the other, there's no doubt Yang was a popularizer of this idea, and his candidacy educated people. It's a big country. There must be at least one person out there who, upon hearing about these ideas about UBI, had a change of heart and switched political parties on this singular issue. Maybe not a lot of people, but that story must certainly be resonating for at least one of the 328 million people in the United States. Although some smaller set than that, right? Not everybody's a registered voter. So on the surface, somebody like Andrew Yang in that scenario could seem like a violation of independence of irrelevant alternatives. I can actually see this both ways, but for me it's not really a refutation of the argument. That's why I said he was an educator and a popularizer. I think those are notions which, in extreme cases, may have gotten someone to lean one direction or the other politically. To me, the response there is about that being an educational factor and something newsworthy and, a debate for ethicists and people like that. At the end of the day, if that was a big issue for you, your mind got made up at some point, and then Yang entering or leaving the election should not have caused you to switch parties, simply his presence. So for me, I don't find that to be a strong criticism of this criteria, the independence of irrelevant alternatives. Thanks to this week's sponsor, BetterHelp. BetterHelp is an online service that connects you with licensed professional counselors. The service is available for clients worldwide, and their extended network of counselors bring a broad range of expertise to the table. BetterHelp is committed to facilitating great therapeutic matches, so they make it easy and free to change your counselor if needed. It's more affordable than traditional offline counseling, and financial aid is available. Anything you share is confidential. BetterHelp can give you a personalized match of your own professional therapist in under 24 hours. You can start messaging them immediately and schedule weekly video or phone sessions. All of this without ever having to sit in an uncomfortable waiting room. BetterHelp is convenient, professional, and affordable. If you want to start living a happier life today, as a listener, you'll get 10% off your first month by visiting our sponsor at betterhelp.com/dataskeptic. Data Skeptic, all one word, lowercase, no nothing in the middle. BetterHelp, HELP.com/dataskeptic. But moving along, next criteria. Remember, not all of these can hold. Unanimity. If everyone prefers Alice over Bob, then so must the resulting social preference order, meaning the final outcome. Now, interestingly, in any sufficiently large population, it doesn't seem like unanimity is a realistic use case. Where I live, we just concluded our block club elections, and we did have some unanimous appointments there, but not quite the voter turnout we were expecting. In the U.S. election, did literally every person prefer Biden to Trump? No, obviously not. Does literally every person prefer Biden to Kyle Polich? That's me, by the way. I don't know if I said my name earlier. No, I bet at least one out of the possible voting Americans would prefer me to Biden. Truth is, I think that's missing the point. It doesn't matter if you would ever be in a unanimity situation in real life. This is just sort of the weakest, most basic, most obviously correct property we can state about what a voting system would have. Think of it like an asymptote in that regard. If literally everyone wants spaghetti more than sardines, then there should be no possible way that sardines wins the lunch election. Any election that fails to do this basic thing is garbage. And we just need that very weak assumption. We don't need something stronger like, if 99% of the people prefer this, then that's the winner. That may be a natural consequence, but the unanimity criteria, pretty obvious criteria we want to have. Now, depending on where you read about it, you'll see parts of the argument here presented in a number of different ways. The original text uses two premises that end up being equivalent to the unanimity criteria. But if you encounter monotonicity or non-imposition, that's why. Although it's a fairly different framing, I'm pretty convinced it's an isomorphic framing, and unanimity is just a conciser way to describe it, especially in audio format. Okay, next criteria. Unrestricted domain. What does that mean? It means the result should be deterministic and complete. Well, deterministic is obvious. The total should always be the same regardless of the order you count the votes. And complete, meaning that the final decision needs to rank every candidate in some overall global order called the social preference order. Last criteria. Non-dictatorship. Why is it last? Because I covered the easy ones first. Let's start with the definition of a dictator. The formal definition tells us that there is no voter whose strict preference will always prevail. A strict preference means that the final outcome is a perfect match for their preference in exactly the right order. So remember, this is ranked choice voting. Let's say we're going to talk about preferences over A, B, and C. Then someone who's a dictator, if they say A, B, and C, then the outcome should be A, B, and C. Surely with enough people, just by chance, someone, in fact probably many someones, will cast their vote in a way that is a perfect match for the final outcome. That's to be expected. The dictator part arrives if no alternative would yield something different. Let's say I'm the dictator, and we collect all the votes. Whatever our voting system is, and again, we haven't really given an algorithm. We're talking about voting systems in general based on the properties they have. There's an infinite number of algorithms or approaches, as long as they meet these criteria. If I'm the dictator, then you could say, well, put Kyle's vote aside, but the other votes, let's change them in some way. Let's commit election fraud. Let's move votes around. And if you commit enough election fraud, eventually the outcome should change. Switch enough ballots, and they would say, Kyle, originally you picked the leader, now you no longer do. But if that's not possible, if no matter how many votes you flip, the outcome always is what I said it would be, then I am the dictator. The dictator part shows up if no alternative would yield something different. An alternative being, if the votes were different in some way, except for mine as the dictator. Okay, we're done with our criteria. If you'd like to set up a voting system and you want the outcomes to reflect unanimity, independence of irrelevant alternatives, be complete, be deterministic, and not be a dictatorship, then you're in for some heartbreak. You can't have all of those things at once. Now, another quick aside, many corporate structures, and I presume the military, all by design have a sort of chain of command. Chain of command is, under this definition anyway, a type of dictatorship. While information and opinion and advice might flow up the chain, a single dictator makes a decision in some cases. So the basic structure of the proof takes the other premises besides the dictator one, and then they prove they kind of derive from those. If all of those are true, then there must be a dictator. Okay, how do we get to that? Well, first things first, we take a weaker position. We look for, and I encountered a number of terms for this in the literature, the decisive voter or the pivot voter. I'm going to use the term pivot voter. Imagine an election where there's candidates A, B, and C. The voters are submitting their ranked choice votes, and given enough votes, you probably get at least one combination of every order. That's not used in a proof. I'm just emphasizing that people's preferences can be all over the board. But let's assume it comes down to a close race between A and B. We've got to have a winner, so let's assume A wins. But then maybe you were on the B team and you're thinking about the next election and you want to think hypothetically. Consider, what would it have taken for B to win? Well, in order for that to happen, at least one person, maybe many people, must change their voting order such that they previously had B below A, and now they move B above A, right? If B is to prevail, they have to make progress on A. Making progress on C is, well, maybe they need that too if they're in last place. But if A won, you have to make progress on A. Otherwise, who cares? But at some point in this hypothetical path, you keep changing votes of a few people where Previously, they preferred A, and you move B above A in their rank ordering. Eventually, the election has to go to B because of unanimity. If you flip enough votes, B must win. And that switchover has to happen with one final vote somewhere, the vote that broke the camel's back. That vote is the pivot vote. And let's just take a moment and all agree the pivot voter exists, right? Very non-controversial. A was winning, B has a groundswell. If that groundswell pays off, there is some pivot vote that switches things over. But with what I've said so far, that pivot voter just seems like a random person, right? They don't seem very special, so what? And that is where we get to the hardest part of Arrow's impossibility theorem. Let's take a quick break, and we'll get into that key step right after this. Thanks to this week's sponsor, Springboard School of Data. Did you know data science is a fast-growing career field with 650% growth in jobs since 2012 and a median salary of $125K? Springboard has identified that data careers are going to shape the future and has responded to that need by creating the Springboard School of Data, a comprehensive end-to-end data career program that encompasses data science, data analytics, data engineering, and machine learning. Each Springboard course is 100% online and remote, and each course curriculum is tailored to fit the schedule of working professionals. Every Springboard student graduates with a portfolio of projects to showcase their skills to potential employees. All of Springboard's data courses are supported by a vast network of industry expert mentors. Springboard's tuition-back guarantee allows students to secure the role of their dreams and invest in themselves without risk. Want to learn more? Springboard is exclusively offering up to 20 scholarships of $500 to listeners of Data Skeptic. Simply go to springboard.com/dataskeptic for more information. All right, let's recap on how far we've gotten so far with Arrow's impossibility theorem. In any ranked choice voting system, so far we've established there exists a pivot voter, and that's a person who under one particular scenario could change their vote and change the outcome of the election. That's actually rather obvious. Might be hard to think of on a large scale, but think of a small community vote. Sometimes there's a tiebreaker. Your voting system should work at the smallest and largest of levels, needs to scale. So during this next part, we're going to spend a lot of time with that pivot voter. What we'll see next is that the pivot voter is actually special, and thus, by our definitions, is a dictator. So most proofs of this use the word profile in a fairly specific and convenient way. A profile is an arbitrary ordering of votes conveniently sorted for demonstrations purposes. So think of a sort of matrix. The columns are the ranked choice votes. So if I like alphabetical order, I have A at the top, B below it, all the way down to Z. And of course, the ordering of the votes doesn't really matter, but we can conveniently sort it. And for whatever reason, my brain intuitively wants to put alphabetical order on the far left, reverse alphabetical, someone who votes Z, Y, X, all the way down to A, on the far right, that these are polar extremes. But of course, there's every combination in between. Anybody can vote any way they want. But we want our voting system to apply in all cases. So let's talk about a few special cases that articulate the point. So imagine one profile in which everyone votes A, candidate A at the top, and Z at the bottom. A wins by unanimity, right? Pretty easy. In the other extreme, if everyone ranks Z at the top and A at the bottom, then Z wins, again by unanimity. And you can ponder lots of these profiles. Do a mental copy and paste of the profile where A wins unanimously and mutate it slightly so that the last voter on the far left in the arbitrary order suddenly moves A from first place to last place. This is how we find our pivot voter, right? We just move people around. We just reorder one column at a time until a change happens. The structure of this proof is to envision a few key profiles in this way. So you will need some sort of mental picture for a lot of these next parts to follow. Now let's get back to the pivot voter. I find it very convenient to picture that pivot voter somewhere in the middle of this spectrum. So everybody to the pivot voter's left prefers candidate A, everybody to the pivot voter's right prefers candidate Z, and then A's position of A versus Z will decide the election strictly as it comes with A versus Z. At least that's as far as we've come so far. So roughly speaking, there's three profiles, or really three sets of profiles. A wins everywhere, Z wins everywhere, and some sort of split where there's a pivot in the middle of a very decisive election, A versus Z. Now, let's consider candidate X. And despite being alphabetically close to Z, in the profiles we're talking about so far, X must come between A and Z in the social preference ranking. And this is an important part. We're going to consider literally every possible roll of the dice of how people fall out on X. The proof will establish that we don't actually care what most people think about X. We're only going to end up caring what the pivot voter thinks about X. Now here comes the one weird trick governments don't want you to know about. The pivot voter, right there in the middle. We already know that they could switch A and Z and thus can switch the election for A versus Z. But the pivot voter has another slick action they could take. What if they move candidate X into their first place position, bumping candidate A down to second place, leaving Z all the way at the bottom? And only the pivot voter makes this change, and it's a seemingly minor change. So now we invoke independence of irrelevant alternatives. A was winning, A was beating Z. The only thing that changed was X, so it must still hold that A ranks above Z. Think about the profiles that'll help convince you of that. Remember the first profile in which A was dominant over Z. We agreed, A wins. And our new profile slightly changed, but because of independence of irrelevant alternatives, we can kind of inherit or reference the other profile and say, if we don't break that rule, we have to maintain the same social ordering. So our mutated profile and the original must share the same rank choice preference A over Z. Now the pivot voter still isn't proven to be a dictator, but we can label them a pairwise dictator. They're able to influence one pair. And this is all specifically under the created profiles we talked about. So it should still feel a little arbitrary. You could always find some pairwise dictator. I mean, that's a feature, not a bug, right? There need to be tiebreakers, as we said. But the next part of the proof establishes that, in fact, there is a single pivot voter who is all of the pairwise dictators, and therefore the dictator by definition. For the moment, let's not jump to the conclusion. Maybe we'll get a little hand-wavy before we're done. What if there were other pairwise dictators out there? Well, one thing would have to be true. The other dictator would have to be ranked before or after the pivot voter in the profile, right? To the left or to the right. If the rank is the same, it's the same person. Should there be another pairwise dictator out there, they're to the left or to the right of the one pairwise dictator we know about. Now, depending on which direction you're looking, they certainly could change their vote and cancel out our pairwise dictator's vote. You know, they saw the dictator move Z from the last position to the first, swapping it with A. They said, I used to have that ranking, I'm now switching mine, we'll cancel each other out. But they don't have that power on the other side. There is another pairwise voter, symmetrically on the other side, who could change their vote and kind of cancel things out, but neither, in and of themselves, is a pairwise dictator. Therefore, they aren't a dictator. Now, another way to think about this is to imagine we have a group of potential dictators. So we round up all the suspects, split them into two groups. Then, see if each of those individual subgroups' preferences will dictate the election outcome. If they don't, then there's not a dictator in there. But by definition, if you have a dictator in that subgroup, it doesn't matter who else is in the subgroup, that dictator's vote, and thus the group's vote, should dictate the outcome. So if you keep splitting in this way, one of two things is going to happen. Either you'll get to a point where you split into two subgroups, and both are dictators, in which case there isn't a dictator by contradiction, or you will whittle down that group until it contains only one decisive voter, the dictator. So what have we established here? If we start from some specific profiles, this, unanimously polarizing candidates, we can develop I don't want to call it arbitrary, but a constructed example in which we have a dictator. Could it be that this pivot voter who becomes a dictator is only a rare, weird case? Well, that's a bit hard to say. I'm not sure how you count them exactly. I started off on what might have seemed like a tangent explaining the halting problem a bit. It would be impossible to develop quality assurance software that could detect all infinite loops. It would be impossible to develop a voting system which has all these criteria that seem to be very fair and desirable. We established that in sort of a constructed way. We show cases in which these violations happen. How often will this affect everyday life? That's really a separate question. It's certainly no reason to throw up our hands and say, no voting system is fair, so just do whatever you want. Surely some improvements can be made if you think improvements are required. But do keep in mind, if you continue to improve a product long enough, you will eventually ruin it. Arrow's impossibility theorem is important, despite being mentally taxing to parse. But there you have it, Arrow's impossibility theorem. If this audio overview is not deep enough to your liking, I highly recommend the paper 3 Brief Proofs of Arrow's Impossibility Theorem by John Giannakopoulos, Economic Theory, Volume 26, 2005. That delves deep into these things from a very axiomatic level and walks you through all the proof concepts. Well, that concludes this installment of Data Skeptic Consensus. Our theme song is Paradox by Odling. Claudia Armbruster is our associate producer, Vanessa Burciaga does guest coordination, and I've been your host, Kyle Polich.